Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hybrid meeting of the Policy and Resources Committee. I would remind all attendees that this meeting is being recorded and webcast live on the Council's YouTube channel. I've agreed to the attendance of some members remotely and would remind all remote attendees to mute their microphones when not speaking, and please raise your electronic hand should you wish to speak. Can I now ask if we've got any apologies or substitutions?
Yes, Convener, apologies from Councillors Bell, Boyd and Fairweather, with Councillors Devine, Meakin and Fotheringham substituting.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interest or statements of transparency? No, I don't see any, so we'll move on to item 3, which is the minutes. First of all, minutes of the previous meeting on the 6th of June. Are those agreed? And minutes of the special subcommittee on the 6th of June. Are those agreed? Thank you. Moving on to item 4 is the 2023-24 final capital budget general fund, and I will pass over to Director Ian Lorimer to talk us through this one.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, members. This report seeks approval of an updated capital budget for financial year 23-24 for the Council's General Fund services. You might remember when this budget back in March, we had a provisional capital budget agreed at that time, and that budget has since been updated for the actual progress on capital projects that was achieved by the end of the previous financial year. The budget that's before you today, that's been reviewed by the Capital Projects Monitoring Group. They've gone through that in quite a bit of detail. There's no real change to the total amount of capital expenditure that's being proposed. There's no new projects being introduced. It's really just a change to the phasing of when we think the spending will be incurred, based on effectively 5-6 months on from when we set the budget. You'll see from the report that there's just under 15 million of expenditure we thought would happen this financial year, 23-24. We thought would happen this year when the budget was set in March. That is now anticipated to be incurred next financial year. The main reasons for that, really a couple of big, 2 or 3 big projects. The main one is the reprofiling of expenditure on Moneyfeast High School replacement. I want to emphasise that's not about the changing the programme or the timescales for delivery of that project. It's really based on updated information from the contractor in terms of when they would expect to incur their costs and therefore bill ourselves. So that's the most significant rephasing that's occurred. But we've also rephased the Angus Rural Mobility Hub. That's a Tay-Cities project, and also the vehicle replacement projects, to better reflect when we now think the expenditure will be incurred. So we think, although the spend planned now for 23-24 is lower than previously assumed, we think those budgets are realistic and achievable. That's probably all I wanted to say by way of introduction, Convener, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Ian? Councillor Devine.
These are just 2 very small questions, and it's really for clarification. On page 20 and 21, you've got departmental borrowing against some of these. I was just wondering where the departments borrowed from, and also on page 22, there's an item there, transfer area at Resteneth. I don't remember seeing that before. I just wonder if you could explain what that is. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks, Councillor Devine. Yeah, departmental borrowing. So there's part of our capital expenditure that is funded, particularly around areas like vehicle replacement, that is funded from the revenue budget resources of certain areas, and that's because they've got a budget to pay for those borrowing costs, rather than it being part of the Council's corporate budget borrowing costs. And oftentimes where there's departmental borrowing, it's because there's an income stream, separate income stream to pay for that. So we distinguish between what I would call corporate borrowing and departmental borrowing. In terms of the transfer area at Resteneth, I'm trying to find that. Did you say page 22? Yes. Yes, that's a waste project. I think that was around the bulking up of waste so that we can transfer it on into the disposal facilities that need to go elsewhere. I'm not sure if Mr. Daly's on the call. He's possibly not, so I can come back to you just to confirm on that one.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? No. Okay, we'll move to recommendations. We're asked to note the contents of the report and the remaining uncertainty. We're asked to approve the contents of the updated General Fund Capital Plan at Appendix A and note that the 2023-24 capital budget represents the Council's approved budget for the General Fund capital monitoring purposes. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Now move on to item 5, which is the 2023-24 final revenue budget documents, and I'll pass back to Mr. Lorimer.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, this is similar to the report we've just looked at in relation to capital, but this one deals with the revenue budget. Again, when the budget was set back in March, there were a number of assumptions made, particularly around government grant, that had still to be confirmed. That's now happened in terms of the finance circular. Our grant allocation is about £1 million more than we'd previously assumed, but it's all for things that for costs that we're going to incur. Most of it actually is in relation to pay costs. So none of that extra is available to be used for other purposes as is set out in the report. As also outlined in the report, there's a corporate budget provision has been made for pay increases in financial year 23-24. The teachers' pay deal has been settled for a number of months now, so the budget, the proportion of that corporate provision required by our education and lifelong learning service in relation to teachers, that's been allocated out. But because negotiations are ongoing with other staff groups, the remainder of that pay provision has been held centrally meantime, and we'll allocate that out to service budgets once the pay negotiations have concluded. Paragraph 5.6 in the report highlights an issue that needs to be corrected in the budget, something that we've picked up in between March and now. So when the budget was set back in March, the Finance and Change Plan included a saving of 100,000 in the Vibrant Communities and Sustainable Growth Directorate that was related to an affordable housing contribution. Now that contribution will still be made to projects, but because those projects are not part of the base budget, they can't be taken as a saving. So the money is needed to pay for the costs rather than be able to be taken as a saving. That was a misunderstanding when we set the budget, and really that now needs to be corrected because the change programme savings is effectively overstated. What we're proposing to do in this report is to fund that 100,000 shortfall on the change programme from the 2.6 million provision we've made for non-pay inflation that's mentioned in paragraph 5.5 of the report. So it's neutral overall, but it does use up some of that non-pay inflation provision. And the report just finally asks for approval of all of those various changes that are set out, and for the final budget volume to be published, and that will represent the revenue budget monitoring budget for departments to work to during the rest of the current financial year. Thank you. Again, questions, happy to take any.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? No questions. Any comments? No. We'll move to recommendations, and as Mr. Lorimer's already mentioned, we are asked to note the amendments and updates on the corporate revenue budgets and approve the publication of the final revenue budget volume, taking into account the amendments. We're asked to approve the removal of saving from vibrant communities as discussed. Is that agreed? Thank you. Move on to item 6, the preparation of the 24-25 General Fund revenue and capital budgets. And once again, I'll pass over to Mr. Lorimer.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I'm afraid it's that point in the year again, councillors, when we need to begin the process of planning for next financial year and developing a full set of budget proposals for consideration. There were a number of changes you might recall to the budget preparation process that were made, including changes to the membership of the Policy and Budget Strategy Group that were made for the current year's budget setting process. I think those went reasonably well, and this report before you today recommends continuing those revised arrangements as we begin the preparation of the budget for financial year 24-25. Really, the approach and the timeline that's been recommended, very similar to last year. Really, the only significant change, if it is indeed a significant change, is the end date for the budget. If possible, I'd like to bring that back into the latter part of February rather than early March, really just to avoid a bit of overlap with other work that the team have. Going back a few years pre-pandemic, we used to set the budget in mid-February each year, so I'd like to get back to something closer to that if we can. But that's really the only substantive change. It's very much a similar approach to what was adopted last year. Policy and Budget Strategy Group, the PBSG, that group met last week. They've reviewed the contents of the report and were generally supportive of the timeline and approach. Again, happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Councillor Duff.
Thanks, Convener. Really, I've got a comment rather than a question. So I don't know if there's no questions. You're happy with me just to make a very brief comment. In March at the budget meeting, where we increased the council tax by 6%, I anticipated that 2024 would see another increase in our council tax around the same region. Whilst we're, as Mr Lorimer said, we're at the start of the budget process with the first PBSG meeting last week, it's likely that we're again facing a very challenging process of balancing services against available resources. The financial gap over the 3-year period to be bridged is about £60 million. While there are many uncertainties at this point, I would expect us to need a significant council tax increase in 2024 to allow us to balance our books and to preserve services that the public value. Members will of course be aware that the Angus Band D council tax rate is about £100 lower than the Scottish average.
Thank you. Any further comments? No, I'll move to recommendations, and we're asked to approve the broad strategy and approach, approve the budget timeline, note the intended continuation of the revised arrangements, and note the final sign-off of the budgets is intended to take place in February. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Now we're on to item 7, which is the approval of an anti-tax evasion policy, and I'll pass back to Mr Lorimer.
I've got a busy day today, Convener. Thank you. Yeah, the Council already has very strong corporate governance procedures. Those are reviewed every year, and that covers all of our activities, and includes, our whistleblowing policy, our counter-fraud policies. All of that is already in place. Our financial regulations also state that all elected members and all employees of the Council are personally responsible for reporting suspicions of fraud or irregularity concerning any aspect of council business. So all of that's already there. So in many respects, our existing arrangements provide a good level of cover should the council ever be accused of facilitating tax evasion. But really what we're proposing in this report is to strengthen that even further now with this specific policy. The report and the policy recommended for adoption are about ensuring the council is complying with best practice, and it means that we're really going a stage further than what we already have, which, as I say, is really very strong. The policy sets out the definitions of tax evasion, examples of the types of tax evasion that we may encounter as a council. It also sets out an action plan to go along with the implementation of the policy, and you'll see from that there's proposals around training and assessing the level of risk, etc., etc., etc. So the policy and the action plan is intended to help us minimise the risk of the council being accused of facilitating or not doing enough to prevent tax evasion in a manner which is deliberate and dishonest. That, there's quite a tight definition in relation to that. So we think it's a good thing to have in terms of best practice to add to our existing governance arrangements around these things. Again, happy to take any questions, Convener.
Thank you. It seems to be a prudent approach. Do we have any questions? Councillor Gregg.
Thank you, Convener. I have a question in relation to page 60 of the combined papers, which is the quality impact assessment, specifically step 4. Which people does your proposal involve or have consequences for? On the notes that I've downloaded, there is a note from a council officer for under service users, and it says, "Not sure I agree there is no impact on service users. Those who seek receive support from welfare rights and/or social work teams." I was just wondering if you could maybe expand on that, perhaps.
Yep, through you, Convener. Thanks for the question. That note should not have been left in the final version, I would say, Councillor Gregg. I think in the original drafting of the Equalities Impact Assessment, the assessment was that it would have no impact on service users, but we've since updated that in light of the comment that was left, because the policy potentially could be quite wide-ranging and have a relevance there. So that's why we've amended. The note shouldn't have been on that final version. That's been missed in the final edit, but we do think there potentially is an impact in relation to that.
Thanks. Councillor Meakin.
Thank you, Convener. I have a question regarding this anti-tax evasion policy and the Welfare Rights Service. As a previous welfare rights officer, I have some concern that when people come to welfare rights for advice, they expect confidentiality. They can tell the person they're talking to basically anything. Now, in the interview situation where welfare rights are actually interviewing someone and advising them, it can come to light, for instance, that they may be being paid benefit more than they actually should be. Now, as I recall it in the past, the process that we undertook was that we would actually tell the person that we believed they were being overpaid, and also then back that up in writing. We would tell them that they should approach the DWP and advise them of that. Now, whether they did that or not would have obviously been up to them, but we would strongly advise them. I can see a scenario where someone's actually visiting welfare rights for confidential advice and maybe disclose that they're actually receiving a taxable benefit. And that information might not have got to the Inland Revenue. So I wonder if there's any sort of protection, or whether that can be looked at, the issue of welfare rights and the role that they play in providing confidential advice. What we wouldn't want is a situation where someone won't come to welfare rights because if they tell them anything, it could go somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, Councillor Meakin, a very valid point. And as you say, we want to make sure that people are not afraid to approach welfare rights for help. The other side of that, of course, is that as public servants, we are under obligations to make sure that people are complying with the law, and we're not seen to facilitate or encourage that. I think in relation to this one, if the committee is happy with this answer, that as part of the implementation of this policy and the action plan, because part of the action plan is to have a consultation with individual services, we will specifically look at how we get the balance right, I suppose, in relation to the needs of compliance with the law, but not doing damage to people's faith and I suppose safety to engage in welfare rights. So I do take the point. I think if you're happy that we look at that specifically as part of the implementation and action plan, that would be.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Brace.
Thanks, Convener. I'm maybe paraphrasing a bit, Mr. Lorimer, but you basically said that this brings us into line with best practice. And I was just wondering where we are on the curve here compared to other local authorities. Are we in advance of them? Are they playing catch up with us, or are we playing catch up with them?
Thanks for the question, Councillor Brays. I think the position is mixed. I'm aware there's one or two authorities already have a policy in place, both in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, but I know that a number don't. In truth, this policy probably would have been brought forward a little while ago, but there was a pandemic. It kind of distracted us for a little while. I don't think we've been at huge risk by not having the policy in between times. It's really about putting another layer on top of what is already a good level of governance and assurance, as is confirmed through the external audit process and our own internal reviews each year. So I think we'll be one of perhaps a few that have such a policy. Certainly the last time I looked, not everybody did.
Thank you. Good that we're moving towards it. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions? Any comments? No, we'll move to recommendation, which is that the committee reviews and approves the anti-tax evasion policy at Appendix 1. Is that approved? Thank you. Now on to item 8 on the agenda, and I think this is Mr Lorimer's final report of the day, and it's the response to the proposed response to the consultation on council tax multipliers. I'll pass over to you.
Thanks again, Convener. Yes, this report brings to the attention of the committee a joint consultation actually launched by the Scottish Government and COSLA in July, and it seeks views on potential changes to the multipliers that are used in council tax setting. So that when the council sets its council tax, it sets the tax for Band D, and the amount of council tax that is then payable by taxpayers in all of the other bands, bands A to H, is determined based on multipliers that are applied to that Band D. Now, those multipliers are applied nationally. Those are not local choice for the council. And the current multipliers as are used is shown in Appendix 3 of the report. Now, as we all know, taxation is a necessary part of providing public services, but of course views will vary on the levels of taxation and who should pay and who should pay how much, etc., etc. Now, the consultation covered by this report asks for views on whether taxpayers who live in properties in the four highest tax bands, four highest council tax bands, should pay more, and if so, how much more. Now, in Angus, we've got just over 13,100, what we call, to use the technical jargon, chargeable dwellings for council tax purposes. So that's about, so we've got 13,100 chargeable dwellings for council tax purposes, and that's about 23.5% of our entire tax base that fall into those top four bands. On a Scotland-wide basis, the bands E to H is about 28%. So Angus has got slightly fewer of our total council tax base in those bands than the Scottish average. But the Scottish average masks some pretty big variations. So, for example, in East Renfrewshire, 57% of the entire tax base is in bands E to H, whereas in the Western Isles it's only 11%. So the consultation and how that consultation will impact will be very different across the country. Of course, we're interested in Angus. Paragraph 4.2 of the report sets out the main points as we see them as council officers, and that's what's guided really the preparation of the draft council response to the consultation. On balance, the response is supportive of changing the council tax multipliers, and that on balance view is driven mainly by the council's financial position. The additional income which could be raised is significant, although I would say it's not a solution to all of our financial challenges on its own, but it would mean, if it was applied, and it would be a national decision as to whether it is applied, it would mean fewer spending reductions, fewer service cuts than might otherwise be the case. Now, the response also highlights such changes would make the tax a little bit less regressive, but it does suggest that the changes, if they were to be implemented, would be phased in to give more time to adjust to particularly at the current time in terms of household finances which are under pressure. The changes proposed in the consultation, just to be clear, would not affect just under 77% of the properties in Angus which are in bands A to D. The response, or the proposed response, draft response, is supportive of expanding the council tax reduction scheme alongside the changes to the multipliers. That's to provide more help for taxpayers who may be struggling to pay council tax. Eligibility for council tax reduction is very variable and very much depends on individual circumstances, but I'm suggesting that we should be asking for an expansion of that scheme to go hand in hand with a change in the multipliers. Ultimately, the members of the committee are being asked to approve the proposed draft response with or without amendment, and I'll stop there for any questions, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Lorimer, and I'll ask for questions, and bear in mind we're considering the response to the consultation rather than the merits of the policy itself. Councillor Nicholl.
Thank you, Convener. This is a question. The proposed increase in the rates A to D, 0%, E to H, up to 22.5%. I think this is discriminatory to people with larger houses. It states it will bring in 4.1% extra. Well, could we not just balance it across all the bands instead of hitting the larger houses harder?
Yeah, this is a national consultation, so it will depend very much on the choice that is ultimately made in response to that consultation. But it's deliberately targeted towards, or the proposal is asking the question. The consultation is asking the question as to whether it would be appropriate to increase the charges for the higher banded council tax bands. It's also asking, if so, by how much. So the proposal is to increase it by the same amount as was applied in 2017, but that it doesn't have to be that. It could be different from that, and ultimately that will be a decision for the Scottish Government to make when they consider the consultation responses. And the consultation, although this is a council response, it's open to anybody and everybody to make a response. It's an open consultation.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Duff.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Can I just ask Mr Lorimer just to confirm what the council's response is to question 4? I think I know the answer, but it's coloured rather than marked, and just to clarify that one. It's the question about the timescale over which any increase should be applied.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Duff. Yeah, so page, it's question 4. It's on pages 79 and 80. And what I'm suggesting, the consultation asks the question of, does it all get introduced in one go, in full, in financial year 24-25? Is it phased over 2 years, or is it phased over 3 years, or other? And what I've highlighted within the report is a suggestion of phasing in over 2 years. So that would be the proposed council response in that one.
Thanks. Question from Councillor Gall.
Thank you, Convener. Mr Lorimer, I was just wondering, is there any consideration going to be given to tied properties for either business owners or staff, given that we kind of live in a rural locality and a lot of these properties to carry out whatever profession they have? And obviously, do we have any understanding if there's ever going to be a revaluation, given that we're talking about figures from 1991? I think that's obviously a huge issue.
Thanks, Councillor Gall. The tied properties is really a matter for the assessor in terms of how they view the properties and what they add to the valuation roll. If it goes on the valuation roll for council tax, we will bill on that basis. In terms of valuation, that is a long-standing issue. As you say, the valuations that council tax is based on go back to 1991. So they're well out of date in that sense. I think that is a really big exercise with quite wide implications. I'm not aware that there's any intention to do that imminently, but it is on the agenda as something that potentially does need to be looked at. But there are also bigger discussions happening about whether council tax is the right long-term solution as well. So all of that would be tied in together, I would think.
Thank you. Councillor Wan.
Thank you, Chair. You've actually kind of answered one of my questions there. It was about the council tax system, whether or not this was going to be looked at in a whole, and maybe some other proposal was going to be put forward by the Scottish Government, because I believe that they said they would abolish this many years ago, and I wondered if this was generally just a fruitless kind of exercise. But I think you've said it all. It's going to be unwelcome amongst most of our communities, this. It will affect 14% of council taxpayers in Angus who are on Band E, I think, if I've read that correctly. We've already got increasing bills. I, for one, can't support this increase or the consultation, or what we proposed to put in the consultation. I didn't realise we could fill this online ourselves, which obviously I'll have a look at that myself now. But it was just really to see if I did read that right, Ian. Is it Band E equates to 14%? Is that correct, or is it B and E?
Yeah, through you, convener. Thanks, Councillor Vaughan. Yeah, in Angus we have a slightly higher than the Scottish average number of properties in Band E, which, as you say, is 14%. But conversely, bands F, G, and H we have fewer than the Scottish average. So it's really just about where in the tax base the different properties that we have fall.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Braze.
Yes, Sabina, whilst personally I'm deeply disappointed in the parameters of this consultation, and would have preferred to see something much more radical regarding council tax and local government taxation. That's not what's in front of us. I would like to point out that, with my very rough calculations, if this is a property tax, the people in our smallest properties, Band A properties, will still be paying more, perhaps far more, per square metre than people living in E, F and G properties. So whilst this proposal does go a tiny way towards making it less regressive as a taxation, well, it's what's in front of us, and I certainly support the proposals. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Speed.
Thanks, convener. I'm concerned for older people, as the report highlights, that there may be a higher percentage. Sorry, there's a really bad echo. I'm not sure if it's being heard in chamber.
That should be it now, I think.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, as the report highlights, there could be a greater impact on older people who predominantly may be in those higher bandings. And as we know, there's a housing crisis, and that we wouldn't necessarily be able to help them with any other housing options. I just also wondered as well if we recently agreed to increase the number of properties that the council housing department could purchase off the open market. I just wondered if there's likely to be a risk that within those purchases there may be properties that are within those higher bands. And what I would say is, like Mr. Lorimer highlighted, I think that it will be really crucial in terms of that kind of supplementary reduction, the criteria for reductions that kind of complements any changes.
Mr. Lorimer, do you have a response? Or?
Probably not. I'm not sure that it would affect the purchase of properties in particular. all of those would be judged on their own merits based on where we think the housing need is and addressing the shortage of particular houses with a particular number of bedrooms. So I'm not sure that it would impact that. I suppose it's important to say, just while I've got the mic open, this is a consultation. There's no decisions made yet, and those decisions will be to come. However, this consultation is a bit different than the one we had on second homes and long-term empty properties prior to back in June, where that would be a local decision. If there's a change made here, it will be a change made nationally. All councils the same.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Durno.
Thanks, Mr Lorimer. Can you confirm that if an elderly person is staying in a large house themselves, do they still be able to get a rebate for being a single person in an occupied house? That would make quite a difference to the price, wouldn't it?
Yes, so it doesn't matter which band it applies to. Single person discount would apply. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Duff.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Yeah, I mean, this is clearly a fairly political area, and I think the response from finance officers, I think, I would describe it as a neutral response, which is looking really principally at perhaps fairness and the regressive nature of council tax, and also looking at the council tax yield from a council perspective where we desperately need increased income. And while we all might have differing views, it's open to any member to complete the consultation themselves and put their particular spin on it. But I think it's better to accept the response that the officers have prepared, which I think is a politically neutral response and is probably appropriate for the council to submit. And I'm certainly quite happy with what I've seen in front of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duff. I think that's a fair point. Do we have any further questions? First of all, any comments? Okay, I'll move to recommendations, and what we're asked to do is to note the background to the consultation, consider the proposed response and approve the proposed response. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, we now move on to item 9, Angus Alive, and the update on key issues, and I'll ask Vivian Smith to come and present this one.
Thank you, convener. This report really is a bit of an update on progress on Angus Alive and where we've got to since you set the budget back in March, 2nd of March this year, where Angus Alive's business plan was agreed by all members, and as was the change programme, which sets out a challenging saving for Angus Alive of 1.5 million over the next 3 years. Within the business plan that Angus Alive put forward, there were a number of services that they felt that they could come out of and that would support them being able to deliver that saving. And those included Ingalls Memorial Hall, Brechin Townhouse Museum, Kirrie and the Glens Museum, Arbroath Community Centre, and the work that they had been doing up in Trowes Basin. So I guess no one wants to be looking at coming out of important community assets, and so one of the first things that we thought was important to do was to ask the community whether or not they were interested in becoming involved in running the facilities for the future. So Mr Cargill led 2 sets of engagement since that meeting in March, really positive engagement with communities across Angus in the 4 communities. And there are hopeful signs, I think, that communities want to come forward and participate in taking over and running the facilities. However, this report is recommending that members agree to look at introducing feasibility studies that the communities could take forward using UK shared prosperity funding to enable that to enable them to do that. That will take place over the remainder of this current year through to December time, and so we're working with Angus Alive in terms of their change notice to try and continue to work in partnership through that period to enable a kind of closed position on the things they wanted to progress in their business plan. Now, I think that's a positive position to be in with Angus Alive in terms of their openness to this partnership approach. And in particular, I would highlight the work that Angus Alive will continue to do on an interim basis at Montrose Basin alongside the Scottish Wildlife Trust to ensure that wildfowling can continue for the current season. So members are being asked to consider supporting that community patient in this report, to take it further and get a feasibility study, to support Mr Lorimer as Director of Finance to use some resources as required from reserves to enable Angus Alive to continue to be a going concern over the period and to make any relevant adjustments to enable that all of the investigations to come to a conclusion. And also within the report, Angus Alive Board has agreed that they want to take forward a number of improvements to some of their facilities as detailed in the report, and what we're seeking in here is members' agreements to the procurement authority, because ultimately the properties and also the equipment the property of Angus Council. Thanks, Convener. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions on this report? Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Convener. On page 91.72, regarding the squash court conversion at the Carnoustie Sports Centre, estimated expenditure of £50,000, could you expand on what this money is to be spent on?
I'm just trying to catch up with that. My understanding is, Councillor McLaren, that is a question for Angus Alive. Have actually looked at that in some detail.
Excuse me, Chair.
Apologies. Angus Alive Board has looked at that in some detail, Councillor McLaren, and this is something that they are recommending, so it's not something for Policy and Resources Committee to make a decision on. The decision here in this report is asking for the procurement authority for that. But I do understand that it is to do with the squash court that is well underused, that they want to develop new facilities in, which they think will help to increase their income, which is obviously part of closing that £1.5 million gap.
Thank you. And I just remind everybody that questions should be in relation to recommendations on today's report, and questions on the operational arrangements should be for Angus Alive Board members. Councillor Braze.
Well, in light of what you've just said, I don't really need to comment. I do have kind of very up-to-date operational information on that because I spoke to the senior manager yesterday, but I can chat to you afterwards.
Thank you. Any further questions? Any comments?
Thank you very much. Ingalls Memorial Hall. As a local councillor, my concerns is about how Angus Alive ability to cherry pick the most profitable businesses. Ingalls Hall has the potential to do more. It's a fantastic building, in a lovely garden setting, suitable for various occasions. Some attempts should be made to retain the Angus Council and Angus Alive involvement. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Obviously, that decision has already been made, and we're here to look at the recommendations on the report. Councillor Shepherd.
Thanks, Convener. Just a comment that I've attended some of the engagement sessions, the one at the Arbroath Community Centre, and I think the feasibility study is good to see that going forward, because it'll strike the balance of ensuring the community groups that do take it on know the state of the building, like are the roofs fit for purposes, are they taking on a structurally sound asset, and is it sustainable for them? Because the last thing we want to do is community groups to get involved and then they fail. So I think the feasibility study is going to help reach the right outcome for both community groups, Angus Alive and the communities. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Braze.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I welcome everything. I have no doubt that providing there's sufficient enthusiasm amongst volunteers and a need for facilities in Brechin and in Arbroath and in Kirriemuir, I think that these communities will probably find they have a better facility and a better service than Angus Alive can ever provide for them. Thanks.
Thank you. We seem to have moved on to comments anyway. Any further comments? Councillor Duff.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Really just wearing my Montrose local member hat. I'm certainly very grateful to the efforts that Vivian Smith and Gordon Cargill have made to provide an interim solution for Montrose Basin and the issue of wildfowling, which will start imminently. And there was a lot of concern in the Basin Management Committee that there was going to be an issue, but I think we seem to have got a solution for this year, and that's very welcome, and thank them for their efforts.
Thank you. Councillor Gregg.
All right, thank you, Convener. Just off the back of just what Councillor Brace had mentioned there, that some of these facilities may end up being better being run by a community group rather than Angus Alive. So I think that goes to show sort of what the level of enthusiasm many councils have for Angus Alive not being very high.
Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Chair. Again, just to say that as far as Kirriemuir is concerned, I have every confidence in the voluntary organisation that's interested in the possibility of running the Gateway to the Glens Museum. They have a lot of experience of past projects, and I'm should they be successful in this one, that they will run it effectively.
Thank you, and it goes without saying that we'll be offering the community groups as much support as we possibly can to take these forward. Any further comments? Okay, we'll move to recommendations, and we're asked to note the detail of progress to date with community engagement, agree the proposal to develop feasibility studies, agree the 4 properties noted will be available to be booked in the interim period, agree the proposed arrangements to support wildfowling activity this season in Montrose Basin, agree the extension of the Director of Finance's delegated authority, and agree the procurement authority for the proposed investment in Angus Alive's facility development programme. Are those agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Thank you. We move on to item 10 and the possible exclusion of public and press. We're asked to consider in terms of Standing Order 28.2 whether the public and press should be excluded in consideration of the following items so as to avoid the disclosure of information which is exempt in terms of Part 1 of Schedule 7A to the Local Government Scotland Act. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you.
John, can you stop the live stream, please?